The precise role of the artist, then, is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through that vast forest, so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place. That's from James Baldwin, from an article he wrote called The Creative Process. Our speaker for tonight, Dr. Beryl Satter, has most certainly illuminated an area and an era that many avoid or of which too many remain ignorant. Her bio is listed in the programs, again, at your table, but I'm going to read it to you briefly now for context. Beryl Satter is a professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark. Her book, Family Properties, Race, Real Estate, and the Exploitation of Black Urban America, won the Liberty Legacy Award and the National Jewish Book Award for History, and was a finalist for the Lucas Book Prize. For her current book project on the history of Shorebank, a pioneering community development bank holding company, Satter was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2015 and an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2016. I'm skipping the middle part of it, but read it all in because it's all really, really good. But Ta-Nehisi Coates drew upon her work on contract selling in Chicago for his award-winning article, The Case for Reparations. So, in fact, to hand off the floor to Dr. Satter this evening, I'd like to read a quote from an article by Coates that incidentally also quotes you later on in the article. If you sought to advantage one group of Americans and disadvantage another, you could scarcely choose a more graceful method than housing discrimination. Housing determines access to transportation, green spaces, decent schools, decent food, decent jobs, and decent services. Housing affects your chances of being robbed and shot, as well as your chances of being stopped and frisked. And housing discrimination is as quiet as it is deadly. It can be pursued through violence and terrorism, but it doesn't need it. Housing discrimination is hard to detect, hard to prove, and hard to prosecute. Even today, most people believe that Chicago is the work of organic sorting as opposed to segregationist social engineering. With that, I would like to hand off the floor to tonight's speaker, Dr. Beryl Satter.
Thanks so much, Jane and Mark, for inviting me, and LSD for making this space for us. I'm a historian. I was born in 1959, so I'm a different generation from most of you. And in my generation, we still were, well, it's a different dynamic now of neighborhood change, but in my generation, there was still a bit of an awareness that neighborhoods in Chicago had changed very dramatically and very quickly from white to black. And a lot of white people had moved to the suburbs. I think if you're, you guys, I'm assuming, are more like 30s-ish. For you, this is a bit of a distant past, and I think that makes it seem all the more natural, which is a problem. Why the city is as segregated as it is, why the south and west sides are so overwhelmingly black, the north side completely white. It's not like there's a natural thing where white people like to go south and north people like to go white people like to go north. It's actually not how it works. There was a lot of both physical violence and economic violence that led to this sorting process that many of you as younger people just grew up in and maybe didn't question. My generation, we didn't quite understand it, but we knew it was new. That much we did know. We knew it hadn't been that way at another earlier. My grandparents were immigrants. They Russian Jewish and German Jewish and British Jewish immigrants. And they were first in what was called Jewtown, which was Maxwell Street, and then moved to 4112 West Roosevelt Road, which was then an overwhelmingly Jewish area. And my parents were both, my mother was from West Garfield Park, and my father, Lawndale. It was through the 30s and 40s and 50s, into the early 50s, an overwhelmingly Jewish area. And interestingly, it was the second most overcrowded community in the city of Chicago in those decades. And the first was the Black Belt. So, in later generations, a mythology would arise that this area out here had been beautiful and fine and the best, one of the best in the country and all that stuff. But as soon as I started looking at it, it was built, in the early 1890s, early 1900s, teens, I forget exactly, but in there. By the 20s, as Jews started moving in, it was no longer considered disreputable. And there was the step up from Jewtown, which was even more crowded and went down. But there was an idea that this had been this great area. White people who left or who were distant from it thought of it as a gorgeous neighborhood that somehow black people came and then it got bad, you know. But if you read novels, like there's a famous novel called The Old Bunch written in the 30s about Lawndale, and it said, "Man, we can't wait to get out of here. You know, this place is a slum. We can't stand it." When it was a Jewish neighborhood. So I think that's worth knowing. And one of the reasons the Jews who lived here, as well as the Polish people and the Italians who lived in South Lawndale, left was because it was seen as a sort of a immigrant stopping point. And you didn't want to get stuck in the immigrant stopping point. It meant you hadn't progressed in this country. Okay? So, so there is this long history which my book uncovered. And I'll just tell you a little bit about sort of how I got into it, what's in the book, and some of the what happened as these communities switched from one community to another, and again, this sort of expropriation and exploitation that was part of that shift. I'll first tell you how I got into it and why it's called Family Properties, because it's in fact, the book is in part about my family. So I told you my grandparents, my parents lived here on the west side. My four siblings were all born in this neighborhood. I was born in South Shore. We left at that point by 59. But I got interested in all this because of my father's work. My father was an attorney, child of immigrants, working class family, born in 1916, grew up in the Depression, and this was a kind of a radical generation that grew up as capitalism was collapsing, you know. And there was the 10-year, you know, depression from 29 to 39. You know, it hit him in high school, and a lot of my mother's family told me was, oh, you know, the Depression, big deal. It just meant that, you know, everyone became like we had already been, you know. So it was fine, you know, it wasn't that bad. But it was, you know, but for a young person coming of age, you know, it seemed like things were shut down, and there was a lot of radicalism in the air. And he became an attorney. He went to Jewish People's Institute and People's Community College. It was all these kind of things. And then DePaul was one of the few law schools that were led to Jews. The Catholic law schools did. But when he got his law degree in the 30s, the Protestant ones did not. So, so he did get this law degree, but his goal was always to use his degree to help people of his similar background. He didn't want to make the rich richer. He wanted to help working class people. And the story about him, he was an attorney, and I'm the youngest of his 5 kids, and and he died when I was very young. He was 49 when he died, and I was 6, and he had 5 kids between the ages of 6 and 17. And he died at this young age. And I did know growing up that he had done some kind of activist work in the city. I couldn't quite understand what it was because it was a little complicated. I had to do housing. I didn't know what it meant. I would occasionally meet people and I'd say my name and they'd say, "Are you Mark Satter's daughter?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And they just sort of, sometimes they'd say, "Oh." You know, they didn't always say what that meant, you know, which was interesting. So I figured, you know, something, and I knew there was something controversial in what he had done, in part because of those reactions I would get. And then one of my aunts told me that she was looking for a job in a law office, and they found out who her brother-in-law was, and they wouldn't hire her. You know, her last name was Satter, and they said, "Sorry." But we also had newspaper clippings about him, and you know, something was going on. But the other thing that made me know that there was something controversial was my mother's family's reaction to him, which was after he died, they didn't speak well of him. They were like, "Well, you know, he didn't take care of you guys. He should look after his own. He's running after the black people, and he's going to everything for them. And what about us?" And you know, he dies and he leaves, you know, 5 kids and a widow, and you know, they didn't quite say it explicitly, but the implication was, and then we had to take care of him, you know? And he should have done this, and why doesn't he take care of his own? And when I first started researching him, one of the first things one of my uncles said was, you take care of your own, you know that? And I was like, why are you telling me this? I asked you about my father. He said, you take care of your own. I mean, and I didn't, quite know what it all meant. And it turns out taking care of your own is a pretty complicated thing, especially when it means screwing other people. And the tension between taking care of your own and taking care of, or how you define your own. Who is your own? Is it my, blood relatives, or is it my community? And how do I define my community? And what happens when responsibility to a community conflicts with responsibility to family? How do you deal with those things? And those were, so, because of the way my mother's family spoke about him, they wouldn't talk about him much. It kind of, his whole existence in a way, I mean, of course he had passed away anyway, but I couldn't, it was a submerged story. And in the family. And but I knew that something had happened, and I think that was the motive to become a historian, which is what my profession is. I knew that there were things in the past that shaped the present, and that for a young person not understanding that, I needed to understand it. And so I, went to school and did well in school and got a PhD and wrote a book on history. It's before this. It was my way to get out of, I didn't want to work, I remember thinking as a kid, factory, academic, I think I'll try to do well in school. I didn't want to be stuck, because I knew that it's not, it doesn't feel good to have every single thing in your life be a crisis because you can't afford it. I took it anyway, and that's this book that I have here as a security blanket, so I have it here to watch it if I need to. But anyway, so I started looking into, my father's story, and I started, one of my brothers had saved all these clippings from his law offices. He saved them for, decades. And I started to read through these clippings, and that's when I started to understand what he had actually uncovered as an attorney, why he was notorious in the city in the years of the short years that he was fighting these things, and then the story that ultimately led to Jack McNamara, who's here tonight, organizing the West Side and fighting against exploitative real estate practices. And he's still fighting today, and he will speak about that a little later. But so what I found out when I started to read these papers was that my father, as an attorney, he had a downtown office, but he was still living on the West Side, and he stumbled across contract selling as an issue. And I don't know how many people here know what that is. Some of you do, some of you don't. Basically, the story I tell in the book, and I'll tell you here, is that he had a very broad practice, do whatever he wanted, self-employed attorney, and a black couple came to him named Sally and Albert Bolton, and said, we bought a house and we're being evicted, and we want you to slow this thing down. This is how we found out the story. And he said, well, tell me about the house. And they said, it was actually in Hyde Park, and they had moved there in like 55, this was 57, and they said, he asked them, what did you pay for the house? And they said, $14,000. It was $13,900. And he said, wow, that's a lot, because at this point, you could buy a new house in the suburb for $5,000. And for $250 down. And they put $750 down, so, triple. And it was almost 14 grand. So it's like, that's an expensive place. Let me look into what happened here, with this house. And he went across the street to the Cook County, property records, and he looked it up, and he found out a few things about the house. And then he called the Boltons back, and he said, I gotta tell you something. He said, I want you to know that, first of all, the guy who sold you the house, whose name was Jay Garan, had purchased it himself just about 3 weeks before he sold it to you. So I know you thought he was your real estate broker, but he actually owned that house. And then he said, second of all, when he bought that house, he paid $4,300 for it, and he sold it to you for almost 14,000. And it was only a week, a month later, a few weeks later. So they were shocked, and he said, so it's in bad shape. He knew that. He flipped it in this way. He lied to you about owning it, pretended to be a real estate broker, and then he, found out more when they said, well, it's expensive, but we think it's, better than what we have now, and we'll make a try, to pull together the money for it. We're both working, and they said, we just want to talk to a lawyer. So no, you don't need a lawyer. I happen to be a lawyer, as well as a real estate broker, and I will handle this all for you. Why spend the extra money? And sign right here, and it's really no problem. And if you leave, someone else is going to grab it anyway. And I know how much they've been living in the Black Belt in a very, in a like a one-bedroom kitchenette. They had not, which they moved in after they married, and they had now 4 children, and they really wanted it. So he's like, this house is big enough for you. Anyway, I'm your lawyer, I'm your broker, I'm all these things. I'll take care of you. So they had gone for it. They gave the $750 down, and they tried to do this. And then so he's lying about, he's overcharging them. He's lying about his ownership. He's pretending to be the lawyer when he's really looking out for himself, number one. And then the final thing is how he sold it to them, which has ended up being what my book was about, which is that he sold it to them on an installment contract. And again, some of you know what this is and some of you don't, but what that basically means, there's a big resurgence of this kind of buying, by the way, right now. Installment contracts are financed by the person selling the house instead of the bank. So what happens is you make a down payment, so they made $750 down payment. You pay over, usually 20, 30 years, just like a mortgage, you pay monthly, but you don't get ownership. Oh, you pay taxes on it, you pay insurance, you pay interest. It's all folded in. So it's very much like a mortgage, except that if you miss, in Chicago, in Illinois law, if you miss one payment, they could throw you out and keep everything. So that's makes you quite vulnerable. You get no equity until the final payment. And I'll show you when I do slides, one of these installment contracts where it says, in fairly complicated letters, if you miss one payment, you're out. So not only are they being overcharged and exploited by this man, but the way they're buying, it puts them in an extremely vulnerable position, because one mess up and they're out, and that's exactly what happened, because as soon as they moved in, some building inspectors came around and said, you got to replace that back porch, it doesn't look good. If you're not, it's a $200 a day fine, and and then the front porch doesn't look so good, $200 a day fine, you better do it. And then they fall behind, and then they're going to be tossed out after putting down the down payment, which you do not get back. So it's very, very treacherous. And they are trying to keep together. And just another side note here is that if you buy on a mortgage, it would cost several $100s to do foreclosure proceedings. But if you buy on a contract, it costs $4.50 to initiate foreclosure proceedings, because it's like a rental eviction. So you have the worst of renting and the worst of buying, And so that's what happened to these people. And this is how my father learned about this thing. Now the thing is, Black Chicagoans knew about this. That's how you bought. That's how most people bought. My father later calculated 85% of Black Chicagoans bought houses on contract. The rest could buy through mortgages. You might ask, why buy this scary, dangerous way instead of just going to the bank and get a mortgage? And of course the answer is that the banks want to give Black people mortgages. And that's a really critical thing should be taught in every school, certainly in high school, people need to know why, how this happened. So this was, very briefly, federal policy, starting, it's another thing that people think it's there's no history to how we buy property. That, you just put 10% down or 20 and you pay the monthly for 30 years, and isn't that how it's always been done? In fact, that whole method of purchasing property only began in the 30s in the Depression. Before that, way fewer people owned, and you had to put like half down and then pay the rest of it within like 5 years. So that meant, it wasn't a broad-based thing. But these laws changed in the 30s, in 33, 34, because of the Great Depression, the complete collapse of the housing market, complete collapse of housing, of construction industry, and so many people, massive numbers of people going into foreclosure because they couldn't pay. And so that's when they created the Federal Housing Administration to help people, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to help people, A, refinance mortgages so they can stay in the homes, and B, what the FHA did was ensure, they didn't want to have direct government intervention in the housing market, but what they did want to do was stimulate private lending so that people could buy houses. So what the FHA did was say, we will insure mortgages. If a bank will loan to an individual to buy property, we will insure that mortgage so the bank has less of a risk. And then maybe they'll loan, and then maybe they'll start building, and then maybe we'll get the housing industry going. So it's all about helping the housing industry. But the downside of it was that, and it was a very profitable program, it lasted a long, long time, several decades, and was responsible in large part for the massive growth of the suburbs, which is also not a natural thing. And it's not like people just like have this deep longing to be out in these places. You know, they are pushed out there, and then, you know, and there is a carrot and stick, which I could explain. The way the FHA did it was that they'll insure loans, but they won't insure all loans. They actually have to do appraisals first as responsible, you know, lenders, whatever. And so they worked with the appraisal industry at that time was quite racist. I don't think it's changed that much, except for black appraisers. They believed that they had a very explicit ranking of populations in terms of desirability for housing. So at the top was like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and then they went down to Scotch and, you know, Irish, and, you know, then as it got lower, it was Italians and Jews and Mexicans and blacks at the bottom. So they have this, and this is all in their manuals. Like if you have these lower, you know, groups living in a neighborhood, the neighborhood is worth less, and you cannot either insure it much or insure it at all. Because so there was a couple of biases intersecting in the federal housing administration policies. One was an anti-urban bias, and what that meant was that they felt that any property that was older, that was crowded, like that didn't have a lot of space around it, that had multiple units in it, that those were more likely to depreciate in value, so we don't want to insure them. Whereas a brand new property out in a, you know, suburban area that they just, you know, created it and there was space around it and lawns and all that, well, that's brand new and likely to increase. And against older structures. And then on top of that, there's the bias against African Americans and Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans to some extent, and then, you know, other groups moving up their supposed ladder, their scheme. And so their feeling was, so first, a couple like Sally and Albert Bolton, you know, they're both working, they're hardworking people, they're lovely people, they've got these 4 kids who are doing well in school, but their choices are, okay, they're living in the Black Belt area, and the reason that area, you know, that's the South Side, black people were pushed into there by restricted covenants and white violence. White people would bomb black people moving out of that area, and they had covenants written into their property saying we wouldn't sell to you. So, you know, there's a combination of legal and physical force that's pushing them there. And then between 1940 and 1960, the population of the black population of Chicago quadruples, from about 250,000 to about 2 million. And they're still in this little area that was already overcrowded. So it's a horrifically overcrowded community, you know. And someone like the Boltons, say they want to get out, they're in this little apartment, so they have 2 choices. They could try to buy in the black community where they live. And if they go to a bank, the bank's going to say no because it's an older area, it's worn out, it's overcrowded. Of course, it's all those things because they have no option. But nevertheless, no loan if you stay there. So then like, okay, well then, why don't we try to move, you know, 8 blocks over where it's a white area and it's, you know, nicer housing stock and all that. Can we get a loan for that? And the answer is no, because by your very presence of moving there, you are lessening the value of that new neighborhood. So they can't get a loan if they stay, and they can't get a loan if they leave. And this is how it is for many people, you know. And so what is their option? If they wanted better schools for their kids, they wanted what most people, you know, families want, which is space and opportunity and education for their kids. But their only choice is to go with an installment contract because they're cut off from all other options. So if you want to know why would they take something, well, first they don't know, of course, that it's gone 4 times, you know, over 4 times the price. But second of all, it's the only option they have. And it's the only option that many black homebuyers have. But it's a really dangerous, difficult option because, and it wouldn't be so bad to buy a contract if, like, he bought for $4,000 and sold for $4,500, you know, or even $5,000, you know. But they didn't do that. They routinely, the white speculators would go to savings and loans, give them kickbacks, get mortgages. They didn't use their own money to buy these properties. And then buy them, you know, for whatever the going rate was for whites, say, you know, $8,000 for a house, and then turn around and sell it to a black buyer on contract for $16,000, usually double, often triple to quadruple. And there were all kinds of studies done ultimately about this, and the average markup was 73%. That was Chicago Commission on Human Relations did a block-by-block study. And they also found that when these blocks were white, all the houses were bought on mortgages. When they became black, all of them were bought on contract. So contract selling, so my father, you know, first of all, he's just like finding out about this from the Boltons, and he's, you know, explaining to them, you know, what this guy Goran had done, and they said, you know, we really want to fight this thing, now that we, you know, he shouldn't have done that to us, you know, he's our attorney, you don't say you don't offer yourself as an attorney and then use your little secret knowledge that you get to rip people off, and that's what he did to us. So they said to my father, you know, please fight this. So he brought it to court, and they ruled that a contract is a contract, that they signed it. Too bad for them, doesn't matter. My father said, but it's unconscionable, it's going to destroy, you know, and then, you know, it's draining so much money from them. And they are like, contract is a contract. But he started writing about this in the Chicago Defender because his perspective as a working class, you know, activist, leftist of that generation was that the new people coming in were much like his family had been. They were working people, and his job as an attorney was to help them, not to, you know, prey on them, which is what many of the other white attorneys were doing. And so he started writing about this in the Defender, and then more and more people came to him, and next thing you know, he had quite a backlog of people who had bought on contract and who were being ripped off. And I have his legal files, and they're heartbreaking stories of people paying, like, guy buys a house for $3,000, sells it to a black buyer family for $9,000. They pay $8,500 of the $9,000, and then he finds a way to throw them out, you know, to trick them into, you know, falling behind. I mean, there's so many ways to get someone to fall behind. Just send your friend the housing inspector, and it's done, you know. So this is happening, and this is a story that I realized that, you know, I started reading the clippings, and my father, like, took this on as a fight. Again, you know, this had been in the black press. Previously, a guy named Dempsey Travis had been working on this. Different people had. He kind of crossed it over into the white press. But he also wrote for the Chicago Defender, had a weekly column for them, was trying to warn people, you know, this is what's going to happen. And part of this is because he himself was a property owner. He had 4 properties on the west side. And he had a heart ailment, which he had had since he found out about when he was 16, and he knew he was physically vulnerable. And he thought if he could invest in some properties, he could, if he gets too sick to work, the properties will take care of his family. So it's a very typical kind of thing. But then, you know, he bought, you know, where he lived on the west side. And so they were all kind of, you know, around. And one on Congress Street, you know, one on Jackson, they were around here, more or less. And he, but, you know, as he's trying to keep these properties up, all these speculators are snapping up all these properties all around him and moving people in at these exploitative prices. And he calculated, he just looked in the Chicago Defender and saw, you know, that all the listings there, which is a black newspaper if you don't know, were houses for sale on contract. And when somebody, you know, later a journalist came to him and said, how do we find these contract sellers? He said, open up the newspaper. You know, they're all listed. You know, it's not hard to find them. Like, that's how people buy, you know. And he estimated, calculating the percentage of people, of blacks in the city and the desire for housing that people were buying, that speculators were draining black Chicagoans of $1 million a day in 1958, which would be about, now it's multiplied time, it's about $7.5 million a day. And that, as he pointed out, is money that could go to upkeep, to sending your kid to the school, to, you know, training of all sorts, to, you know, it's life, you know, and it forced people to cut to the bone, you know, and the lie is that black people are poor and they move to these neighborhoods, and of course the neighborhoods get bad because, you know, they were poor, and what is this, how poor people are, something like that. But the truth is, as I you know, looked and researched this, that black and white Chicagoans in the late 50s and early 60s, their average income was pretty close. It was like $6,000 to $6,700. Like one was, it was just a few $100s difference. There was a lot of jobs, and that's why they were a prime target, because there was money. You know, so they didn't. It's not like you just sort of naturally. So another way to talk about this is that people sort of have this sense that black, urban, and poor go together somehow. You know, but actually, black people become urban because they're excluded from the suburbs, and I will show you a slide about that. And then they become poor if they do because of these predatory practices that are supported by federal law about redline, you know, that keep banks from loaning and push them into the hands of these speculators who go to town with this and leave them no options and drain all this money. And then, you know, what is left, you know, for the community? I mean, you know, when the Boltons lost their case, I interviewed Sally Bolton, you know, when I was working on the book, and she was an old, you know, elderly woman in her 80s, and she said, you know, she never bought again. She was like, after we lost that 750, she says, that could have gone to our colleges, our kids' college. And we lost it, and she was living in rental housing, and she never bought again. And think about where people build wealth. You know, it's in housing, and white people anyway. And so what happens to the rules that makes housing a source of building wealth for white people, but of losing wealth when black people do the exact same thing, or try to? And there is a public policy history here of institutional racism where, you know, again, like as I said with the FHA, it was sort of an anti-urban bias with anti-black bias with, you know, rules about the suburbs that sort of lock together to lock people in. And that's what you have to unravel and understand. And the other thing that my father, you know, found, and you know, was happening just to play out what it meant if you say you buy and come. So he's in this neighborhood on the west side, and the only people who are, so these speculators are pouring in there. And they are flipping these properties and selling them for huge amounts. And then, so say you buy because it looks like a nice place, and also, by the way, these speculators were very nice to their black customers. They often had black staff, they'd pick you up in their car, they'd show you all around, they were like, you know, just total honey, you know, until they caught you, you know. And so they would show you these places, you buy it, and then you find out that that they didn't tell you the interest when they told you what it would cost. So it's more than you thought. And then you find out that they told you that you could cut the place in half, build a wall, and rent out the back, and everyone does it. And then you find out that was made illegal 5 years ago. You cannot do that, actually. And then you find out that all these things that you thought were going to make it work, it's not going to work. So then you realize, and you can lose the house with one missed payment. So say you're a black buyer and you move there and you want it to make it work, and then you realize, if the husband's working, then his wife has to work too. You know, if they're both already working, they got to get a second job. You know, and there was studies that were, they would talk about what's going on in Lawndale. They're like, well, all the adults are working. And like, why? Because the cost of living is so high. Well, why is it so high that all the adults need to be working? You know, it's the housing was draining them. You know, and the same properties in white areas were, a quarter of what they were paying. So everyone's working, and then you might, of course, you can't do any maintenance because you dare not, do work on the lawn and fix the gate and all that stuff when you got to pour every penny into staying there. What's your option? Is that or lose it, So the place gets overcrowded. The parents are all the adults are working. There's no maintenance, and that hurts the neighborhood. Oh, of course, so populations start doubling. Garbage collection is the same as it was when it was half as many people. The schools start getting jam-packed because, of course, the racist Chicago School Board will not let black students leave their neighborhoods to go to the white district right next door that has empty seats. They're going to keep you there, So, and the way the school districts dealt with this in the 60s was to create the double day, which meant that the kids went half. They gave them less school, half in the morning, half in the afternoon. And the black parents was like, well, shouldn't my kid have a full day of school like any other child? And they're like, oh, don't worry, they tell them just as much, but we can't let them go out. And there were massive protests, school protests by black parents in the early and mid 60s over this. So, all this is going on, but and keep in mind that a lot of the people moving in are coming up from Mississippi where black schools got like, $10 to every 100 spent on white schools. I mean, they got, they were already disadvantaged. And then they come to the city and they're thrown into these overcrowded classrooms and given half a day. And then when they get out, the parents are working, there's nobody there. Gang violence was always a problem in Lawndale. It was a problem in the 20s, 30s, and 40s on the west side. And there's a book by a guy named Clancy Siegel, S-I-G-A-L, about his childhood growing up here, and he talks about all the stuff going on. So, gang violence is nothing new in this area, but when you have, the overcrowding and the parents not working and the double-day schools and all these pressures, it happens too, So what the white people see is, we were living in this area, and okay, it wasn't great, but it was sort of okay. But then, suddenly one black family moves in. Next thing you know, there's 10 black families, and they got, the place overcrowded, and the kids are running wild, and where are the parents, and what's happening to the maintenance, and it's all falling apart, and what's wrong with those people, And then, but some of them still say, well, but I'm a city person, I've always been a city person, this area is, my family's here, my relatives are here, I'm going to stay, But what for the white people living there, what would happen is they would get they would start getting calls by real estate guys asking if they were interested in moving. And this wasn't, this was like, there were stories of people getting like 40 people coming to their door a day, like huge amounts, just constant. And then phone calls day and night. You want to sell, you want to sell. And a lot of pressure about selling. One guy, saved all his cars and showed it to a newspaper guy. So this is all the people who came to get me to sell my place. And of course they want to buy because they could buy, so what they would say, their pitch was usually something like, they knock on the door of a white guy and say, we'd love to buy your place, so what do you think? And they're like, no, I'm not selling that, And then the real estate guy would say, well, I'll offer you $8,000 now, if you did want to move, and it would be cash. But keep in mind, but if you don't want to sell that right now, don't worry. I'll be back in a few weeks, and then I'll offer you $7,000. And if you still don't want to sell, I'm fine with that. I'll be back here in 2 months, and I'll offer you 6. So you take your time, you think about it, but that's how it's going to be. And they knew the longer they stayed, the less they would get. So this is about the pressure. This isn't, again, this isn't just this natural longing to leave the city. There's also this, all kinds of pressures on them, from what things happening to the black neighbors that they do not understand. So the black neighbors are like, we're doing everything to keep our homes up, and we're really trying. And the white people are like, why is it so crowded? Can't you fix it up, And what's with the garbage collection suddenly, and the schools, etc. And then, again, the longer you stay, the less you get, So finally, they will give in, take the money, maybe sell the place that was worth $8,000 for $6,000, and then the real estate guy sells it for $20,000 or $16,000 or something, So he's fine. This SNL that gave him the money to buy the place is fine. And the white family that didn't necessarily want to leave the neighborhood lost a little, but they still have $6,000, which is more than enough for a down payment in the suburbs for a new house. And so they feel like, but they're emotionally, their feeling is, we got driven out of that community. We loved it there, those black people came in and we got driven out, you know? And look how they're keeping it and all this stuff. So it's just this vicious, perfect cycle to get everyone turning on everyone, with a cycle of misunderstanding, you know, even though it is comprehensible. So they go out there, they're saying, you know, they're bitter. They put up more resistance to letting black people come to the suburbs now, because they're like, we got driven out once, we don't want to be driven out again. And so, you know, meanwhile, the black people who moved in, who paid, you know, huge prices, they might say, you know, I came in and it was nice, and now it's really overcrowded in the schools and the problems, and I would like to leave. But how can they leave? They brought on contract. They can't leave. They can't leave without losing everything they put in. So they don't even have the option to move out, you know? And that's this, again, this sort of weird thing where we see it as sort of natural, you know? So they hang on and they struggle, you know? And meanwhile, huge profits are being made. And it's being sort of shared among the white professional classes, because the contract sellers will have a contract that says you owe me 20 grand on a house that I paid 10 for, right? And then they decide they want a little more cash to buy more of these houses. So they sell to some nice doctor, you know, for only, you know, 17 grand. He says, here it's worth 20 and I'm selling it to you for 17. It's a good deal. And of course he only paid 10 for it, right? And then the doctor buys it, and then now he's collecting the money, you know? And he's got a nice investment too, and the guy goes on to buy it to get the next one. And so this ends up destroying the whole communities. And so my father sort of died in the middle of fighting this stuff. And I want to show you some images and stop talking, and then if you have questions. But he died in 1965, and this was the year before Martin Luther King came to Chicago. And a lot of people, when he came, said, you know, we should deal with this contract selling stuff. It's really bad news. And instead he went for rental, the issue of rentals. In part because he didn't fully understand what was happening. But, and he thought contract selling was too complicated, and he also thought, I want to work with the poorest, and people, if they own a house, they're not so poor. Which is actually not quite right, you know? I mean, they weren't the poorest people, but they were people who were really having everything drained from them. And if you want to understand the nature of a lot of these communities that look so drained, there's a reason they look drained. And the quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates about housing and the way, you know, how it operates is very apt. And again, here it is, instead of being a source of wealth for the future generations, it's depletion, you know, for you. So after my father died, sort of in the midst of all this, of a heart ailment, he ended up having to sell his properties for, that's a dramatic story, which I'll leave if you want to read more. But there was a wonderful priest named Monsignor John J. Egan, who had done a lot, he'd been involved with activist work, and he was involved with Suburbs. And he was sent out to Presentation Parish in Lawndale as a punishment because the Cardinal Cody, the new Cardinal, thought he was, again, too much with the black people. You know, you like them so much, I'll send you to a parish where there are no Catholics, you know, on the west side, and he has no money, and, you know, he just put it there. And you can guess there, he's like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. You know, I'm so happy, I'm living with black people, they're so wonderful, and I'm learning so much. And he decided to bring in, he decided, you know, we gotta find out what's going on in this neighborhood, and he decided to do what he had learned from Saul Alinsky, which is that you organize by going door to door and finding out what people need. So he called on, as a priest himself, he went to the seminaries in Chicago and said, anybody want to come here? You could have a one block, well, I'll sign you a 1 block area, and it will be your parish, that 1 block. And you come every Saturday, and you go door to door, and you find out what's happening with people. So, and then you come back and you tell me what you learned, and then we figure out how do we help their problems, and then we mobilize the community. So one of the people came was Jack McNamara here. I want to stand up so they see you. He was, at that point, a young priest, and I'll show you images of him when he was doing this, and he came out and he went door to door, and he was listening to the problems, and one of the people he spoke with was a woman, Mrs. Alberta, who was started crying when she spoke to him and said, I think we could make it, but the housing payments are so high. And he's like, well, how high are they? And she told him, and he's like, that's like double what my family pays in Skokie. Why are you paying so much? He went to Egan. Egan had known my father. He explained, oh, it's this contract sale thing. They ended up organizing that whole community on the west side and then on the south side too, and doing big payment strikes, which was very risky because if you hold back your payment, you can get evicted. But they said, once they understood, like they did, so Jack McNamara brought in college students and they went and they researched all the properties in that 8 square block area to find out how, where, what, and how. And they found out there were contract sales, usually double, right? And then went to the neighborhoods, to people in the houses and told them what was going on. And I'll show you some slides now to show what happened, but this became a huge movement that nobody knows about, because everyone knows about Martin Luther King, but not about local activism, that was happening in Chicago after King left. And they ended up having a fair amount of success in getting contracts renegotiated, and further down the line, helping with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and Community Reinvestment Act, which were the two things that were trying to fight bank redlining, and which we still need desperately because of the subprime crisis, which sort of was a second wave over everything that happened before. So I'll run through these quickly. Yeah, why don't you press the button? I just start with this one, and I start with this one because, I don't think, this is my father and my Uncle Charlie. It was as kids in the 20s in the West Side, and they're kind of like street urchins, they're wearing this sort of, it's like some kind of bodysuit, whatever, but, because they're working class kids, and the knowledge of that stayed with my father his whole career. And when he was, in 1963, he gave some talks to some attorneys, and he said, I want to tell you something, the class of 33 has something that the class of 63 doesn't have. He said, we knew that the poor man was our brother. He says, often he was our brother. And you guys have forgotten that. And that is what an attorney needs to know. Angry 1930s radical kid, and, saying, this lousy, stinking capitalist world, what's wrong with it? And so there he was as a teenager in the 30s, and then you'll go to the next one. And this is in the 50s. And he still looks similar. And this is when he was a columnist in the Chicago Defender for a column called All That Money Can Buy, in which he tried to dedicate to the problems of the working man. Because he just said, this is about the working people of this city, and he would get letters and people would say, I don't know if you're black or white, I can't tell, but it's cool that you're writing this column, and, so he did that. Okay, we'll go to the next one. And this is the Boltons, and so happy when they moved into their house, only to find what it meant after, some payments. Go to the next one. This is very important. Lawndale credit squeeze, 1958. Wanted mortgages. Meeting tonight to air a problem. So it's like, this is in the white press. So everyone knew that you couldn't get a mortgage in this community, even though people are moving there, So I think that's important because people think like, oh, nobody knew or somehow it was undercover. It's not. Next one is, call Negroes good home loan risks. No problem lending to them, but Illinois federal S&Ls has tough requirements, Chicago Daily News, and it's all about how, no matter how good they are, no matter how few defaults, we still want them. So again, this is not a natural thing. This is a constructed process. Okay, next one is very important. Also, again, why did they become urban? Well, it's because of the suburban wall. This says in the top, you can't quite read it, the Chicago Wall. Predict suburbs to open next 5 years, Chicago Defender, 1962. It's like, predict them, they're hoping maybe we'll be able to move to the suburbs in a few years, maybe. And they call it the Chicago Wall because they're walled in without a real wall, but they could have been, because the suburbs, steering, all kinds of things, they just will not let you. So that's how the urban part comes. And then, as we described, how the poor part might come. Next one, this is what the contract for land contract looked like. And it's down here somewhere. There's, you can't read it, but it's in tiny print that, if you miss a payment, you are out. So this is what articles of agreement for warranty deed. This is how people bought houses. Next one is, this is the first piece my father wrote in 1958 about the Boltons. And it says, lawyer reveals unethical actions in property sales. This was in the Chicago Defender. And it says the penalty to the Negro people for real estate injustices is $1 million a day, because he had calculated it by then. He says this is the burden that they carry from this wicked speculators tax, that is a burden upon them, and them only. Says this is the tax they pay for the privilege of being Negro. So the black tax. So he's talking about that in 58, as other people were too. Next one. This was, they had mass meetings in the 50s, 1958, Fight for Your Property, the Dearborn Real Estate Board, which was a black real estate group that is still around, organized this thing. Dempsey Travis helped with this. And West Side, they did it, and the South Side, because it's happening in both places. It says here, Attorney Mark Satter exposed the conspiracy between the mortgage bankers and insurance underwriters to deliver the property of Negroes into the hands of the exploiters. And that may sound like overheated, but it's not really, because the banks are saying we will not loan to black people, we will loan to white exploiters. We'll loan to the speculators, they'll give us a big kickback, but we will loan to them, but we will not loan to a, black person who has worked for 20 years steady, has a down payment, same down payment that the speculator would have made. We will not lend to him. So they are, in fact, delivering what could have been the property into the hands of these people, who will then bring the people tribe, who get that. Next one. This is the Greater Lawndale Conservation Commission, 1958, and my father was talking about explaining everything that was going on, and you see it's a mostly black audience, and they're well-dressed, very reputable people, finding out that they've been taken. For no fault of them, what is their option? Not move, And interestingly, at this meeting, the guy sitting there was a contract seller, and they had like both sides, And the contract seller was like, well, it's, except for communists, what's wrong with, everyone knows that you sell for the best you can, and that's what a capitalist system is, and are you a commie, and things like that. So, it was also just, so that's what the back and forth. But, okay, the next one is, this is a contract seller that Jack Mackenroth, I'm sure, remembers. He owned, hundreds of properties and in Lawndale, and was one of the first people they organized against when some of the people involved on the West Side created the Contract Buyers League that Jack helped get organized. Next one is, these guys were not exactly high life. They were one step from organized crime, if not organized crime, who were, again, getting the kickbacks from the SNLs and buying these properties. And if you look, there's a thing where people often say, the problem in the West Side, or Detroit, or in Newark, or all these places, is the riots. Black people just for some unknown reason riot, and they burn down their own houses, and what do you expect? And now the houses are still burned down, and that's the story. I mean, I've seen this over and over and over. And they don't even bother to say, but actually this block that's empty, there was no riot here. This isn't where it was. Why are you saying that, But what was happening was arson, a lot of arson. And these guys, after selling a contract over and over and over and throwing people out and not putting any money in, and there's nothing left, then they insure it, then they burn it down. So, there's other kinds of arson, but that's one of them, and it's a big one, and they were defrauding, doing a lot of fraud. So these guys were indicted in arson. These two were big contract buyers, contract sellers, I'm sorry. So that's really important to keep in mind, that blame the victim narrative. And I just want to also say that there's a way that people are always saying, black people riot, and, what do you expect, and they burn down their own property, but what they never remember is that white people riot first, you know what I mean? Like, they riot every time a black person moved in, and pushed them into these small areas and used violence and blew it up, and they would be like 5,000 people in the street, and, all kinds of stuff. And that's, never heard of it, There's no commemoration of that. And then, when in reaction to all these things they've done to you, and you're so sick of all the different ways you've been hurt and exploited and trapped, then you fight back. That's the problem. So it's the second half of the story. You got the result, but not the cause. The response and not the cause. And that's, I think, an important thing for people to contest. Next one. This was from 62 contract. The law backs housing racket. It's just saying it's all illegal. There's nothing illegal in anything they're doing. Contract buyers at the mercy of Sharpies. And then the next one is the $1 million a day cost of being black. These are all from my brother's papers that he saved about my dad's work. So finally, this this becomes more and more people are saying it. So next one is just about the different the explosive growth of the black community in Chicago. So here's the black belt there, and that is again a product of violence. People being forced in there, and then the neighborhood quadruples, the community quadruples in size. And so it's all white. Again, this is not a natural thing that people just want to be in these places. They're just beginning to move into little bits of the west side, and the speculators get to work with the S&Ls working together. And you could go to the next slide, and you see that's where they go. But only those places. It's not spread out in any kind of natural way. It's very condensed, and focused. And the next one is just a quote from a middle-class black homeowner in 1959, where he just points out, face it, racial prejudice is profitable in Chicago. Every time a new parcel of land is added to the Bronx ghetto, millions of dollars in real estate profits are made, says this man in 1959. Just because he said, I bought in this place, I put in all this money, now it's falling apart. I don't feel good about it either, but this is why. And then I have, just quickly, King came to Chicago in '66, which is the year after my father died, and he moved to Lawndale and tried to mobilize people. And just very quickly, I'll go through this fast. The next one is, so you could maybe recognize the community where he is. He went to the west side. He tried to move to the absolute worst possible apartment, and so that he could show the conditions. But Chicago was not like the South, and when he got to the apartment, you can go to the next one, they had cleaned it up, because they're like, oh, look, I was famous, So then everyone was joking, so it didn't work. He thought he'd just show the conditions, but it's much slimier and trickier in Chicago than in the South, where it's explicit. And then the newspaper said, oh, if King wants to clean up the ghettos of Chicago, he should just move from apartment to apartment, and then they'll just clean them up as he goes. So that, wasn't great, but the next slide is, this is Jack Egan at Presentation Parish, where he brought his organizing skills to bear to bring together the community. The next slide is, this is Jack Mackenroth, who's sitting here, and Henrietta Banks, who was this brilliant, fabulous, she had been a contract buyer, bought a contract, paid double, found out, and said, I'm fighting this thing, and would go, and she's the one who innovated the procedures of organizing, where she would bring her contract with her to people's homes and say, because first people were like, Adam, by the way, I don't know what you're talking about, go away. And she said, look, she would knock on the door and say, hi, I want to tell you something about what happened to me. And then she would explain how she bought. And then they would say, oh, that happened to me too. And then they were more willing to be open. So she was this like dazzling, wonderful person and a natural born organizer, and they worked together, organizing on the west side. Next slide is Clyde Ross, who some of you might have read about in the Ta-Nehisi's Coates article. He centered it all on Clyde Ross. And this was him when he was working for the Contract Buyers League. And Lucille Johnson, these are all like local people who were fed up and took action and became the leaders of this struggle against the contract sellers, going, picketing their sellers, passing out leaflets downtown, talking to the media, and ultimately organizing a payment strike. You could go to the next slide. Another big organizer, he passed away recently. He was a Chicago policeman, and he was helped organize on the South Side where new housing was being sold on contract. Next one is the great Ruth Wells, also passed away, another brilliant organizer working with the Contract Buyers League. So these were all people who were organizing on their own behalf. They personally had bought on contract. Like this is the late 60s now, and they mostly bought in the mid-50s, late 50s. So they've been keeping it up all this time, and now they were fighting back. So they're more middle-aged people, but they are very serious, and they may put this thing on the map in a big way. Next slide is evictions, because when they said when the people would negotiate, they said, well then you need to. We won't pay you if you won't renegotiate these contracts. So they said you could have a 15% profit, like not 75. 15 they thought was fair. And the speculators were like, no way, you know? So then they stopped paying. So then they called the police to evict people. And as Sidney Sharif said, you know, I'm a cop, and you know, we got crime here, and they won't come, but they bring an army when it's, you know, for the contract sellers. So the next slide is people would then move people back into the houses after they were evicted. And so this was all happening in like 1970, and you know, it was all in the press, it was all in the papers, it's all been forgotten, interestingly, but it was a really important thing. So they just moved them back in, you know. And then the next slide is just, also there's the west side, when they stopped an eviction, and everyone cheering and happy, you know, because they're saying, you know, you're not going to do it, there'd be these big standoffs, and it's a lot of trauma around that. So this is the cover story, and then, sorry, the last one, oops.
What did I do?
To get to that very last one, is just people sitting on a conference table. And it's Dempsey Travis is there, who was a mortgage, owned a mortgage company here in Chicago, and they ended up negotiating some of the contracts with some of the booksellers. Not all of them, but people made, I think it was an average of $14,000 back, which was, there it is, a lot for that period. It's fine. I think you got it. There it is. You know, and they're happy because they're, you know, they're going to get a, you know, it's going to be fair finally, you know. But it wasn't for enough people, and the problem is that these waves just kept coming. You know, after this was, you know, other scandals, and then the subprime crisis, you're always going over the same scorched earth over and over. And that's why this, you know, history, it can help you understand these processes that otherwise just seem, again, you know, it's like you woke up this morning and something happened to these people and oh well, you know, whereas in fact this has a long history, and there's a reason people are in the condition they're in, and the communities are, the properties are in the condition they're in. And that's what we really have to understand if we're going to, you know, change it. And I know now gentrification, you know, there's like a different set of issues. And again, you know, profits from movement of people instead of allowing people to all gain equally. And you know, I don't really have much knowledge on the current situation, but this past matters, you know, and I just, anything that could help shake you up in terms of understanding when you look out there what made it that way, it will be very valuable. So, so that's what I tried to do in the book, and I also, you know, again, threaded the family story, and we'll stop here. So thank you.